Good morning. This is GE 6101 Readings in Philippine History. Today's topic is about the Philippine Constitution. For the learning outcomes at the end of the module, you are expected to, number one, understand numerous continuing issues in the Philippine society over history, identify and study the different constitution that tackles about the different struggle that Filipino to break free from the colonial tyranny, analyze and understand the following constitutions. The 1987 Constitution of Bato, 1899 Malolos Constitution, 1935 the Commonwealth Constitution, 1973 Constitutional Authoritarianism, 1987 Constitution after martial law. The Philippines actually has had a total of 6 constitutions since the proclamation of independence on June 12, 1899. The present Constitution of the Philippines is regarded as the most polished, which is the Constitution after martial law, and also the most responsive to the needs of the Filipino people. But there are actually amendments and changes that are still to be recommended. So we will try to discuss the different constitutions that the country has had. But let us first define what is constitution. A constitution is a codified list of provisions that identifies the limitations of the power of the government and enumerates its responsibilities to the people. It is a set of established precedents and codified principles according to which a state is governed. Constitution is the highest law of the land. Likewise, constitution is the basic principles and laws of a nation, state, or social group that determine the powers and duties of the government and guarantee certain rights to the people. And since 1973, the Constitution of the Philippines has been in effect. It is the supreme law of the Republic of the Philippines. But there are 3 constitutions that have effectively governed the country. Number one was the 1935 Commonwealth Constitution, the 1970 Constitution, and the 1986 Freedom Constitution, which is the present one. The 1897 Constitution of Biak na Bato, it is the provisionary constitution of the Philippine Republic during the Philippine Revolution, which was promulgated by the Philippine Revolutionary Government on November 1, 1897, which is basically, it was borrowed from Cuba, and it was written by Isabelo Artacho and Felix Ferrer in Spanish. And then afterward, it was interpreted in Tagalog. It outlined certain basic human rights, such as freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and the right to education. The government that was established in Biak na Bato was the first constitutional republican government in the Philippines. Now, the Constitution of the Philippines was the Constitution, or the 1899 Constitution, the first for that matter. It was drafted after the Congress of the Aguinaldo Revolutionary Government that convened on September 15, 1898 at the Barasoain Church in Malolos, Bulacan. There were 85 deputies that comprised the Committee on Constitution that was tasked to draft the Constitution of the Philippines. There were 3 initial drafts submitted for consideration: the True Decalogue and the Constitutional Program of Apolinario Mabini. The other one was the Pedro Paterno version, and The third, the Felipe Calderon version, which basically prevailed among the three drafts. So there were discussions and debates on the constitution lasted for a month, from October 25 to November 29, 1898. And the majority of the arguments centered on the provision stipulating the separation of church and the state. And also the provision contradicting it was settled via one vote margin, with the provision for separation prevailing. So after the constitution was approved, it was forwarded to President Aguinaldo. But there were actually some amendments that Aguinaldo would like to amend and to have it returned to the Congress. And this prompted Aguinaldo to approve, because of the decline of the Congress, to consider the amendments. So on December 23, 1898, it was promulgated on January 21, 1898, and they formally adopted it. Now, the Malolos Constitution of the 1899 Constitution provided three significant features, including number one, provision for an independent republic of the Philippines consisting of three independent powers, and that would be distributed to the executive to be led by the president with a term of 4 years and not eligible for election, a unicameral legislative, and the judicial. Number two, the Bill of Rights, and the number three, the separation of church and state. Generally, the Malolos Constitution took into account the constitutions of other countries with marked resemblance, such as those of France, Belgium, and other Latin American countries. That the overall structure of the Constitution was borrowed from Costa Rica, Chile, and Spain. The Malolos Constitution was never exercised as the Philippine-American War broke out on February 4, 1899. And so this led to the downfall of the First Republic of the Philippines with the arrest of President Aguinaldo on March 23, 1901 in Isabela. Now, during the American colonial period, the Philippines was governed by laws, including the Philippine Organic Act of 1902, which provided for the creation of an elected Philippine Assembly composed of Filipinos, and also the Philippine Autonomy Act of 1916 that announced the intention of the United States to withdraw their sovereignty over the Philippine Islands as soon as a stable government can be established. Also, there's this Philippine Independence Act that set the parameters for the creation of constitution for the Philippines. Well, this also called for the election of delegates to a constitutional convention to draft a constitution for the country. The Constitutional Convention on February 8, 1935 came up with a constitution submitted to Filipinos for a plebiscite on May 14, 1935. Then subsequently, it was ratified. It came into effect on November 15, 1935. And then it was amended by the National Assembly in 1940 by changing the term limit of the president from 6 years with no re-election to 4 years with the possibility of having a second term. Now, the Japanese-sponsored government during the Second World War was nullified the 1935 Constitution and appointed the Preparatory Committee as replacement. So the 1943 Constitution, which replaced the 1935 Constitution, was used during the presidency of Jose Laurel in the Second Republic. The 1935 Constitution came back into effect after the war in 1945. and amended on March 11, 1947, with the parity amendment giving the U.S. citizens equal rights with Filipino citizens to develop natural resources and operate public utilities. Now, eventually, Marcos called the Constitutional Convention to amend or revise the 1935 Constitution. The Constitutional Convention on December 1, 1972, came up with a constitution providing for a modified parliamentary government. And this was then submitted for ratification through citizen assemblies created by Presidential Decree number 86, series of 1972. And so the ratification was done via secret ballots, but the legality of this ratification was questioned. However, the Supreme Court affirmed its validity and deemed it to be in full effect. Now, Corazon Aquino, after taking oath over a provisional freedom constitution to formally assume the presidency, she issued Presidential Decree number 13, suspending certain provisions of the 1973 Constitution. That a month later, President Aquino issued Presidential Decree number 9, series of 1986, creating a constitutional commission which was tasked to draft a new charter to replace the 1973 Constitution. And so the commission came up with a constitution on October 16, 1986, which was ratified by the people through a plebiscite on February 2, 1987, with Presidential Decree number 58. The new constitution came into full force and effect on February 11, 1987. The new constitution was written in such a way that it would provide provisions, significant provisions for checks and balances to prevent the amassing of government authority by one entity or one person, just like the 1973 Constitution. So its preamble summarily implies the general perception against the rule of tyranny and oppression. And yes, the 1987 Constitution was ratified on February 2, 1987. Yes, it was formulated by the Constitutional Commission led by Cecilia Munoz Palma, that it pushed for the restoration of the presidential government and protection of human rights. And some of its features, there would be a longer term, but without election for president, abolition of capital punishment, party list representation and creation of Sandigang Bayan, creation of Human Rights Commission, controlled power of president in declaring martial law, unlike the 1973 Constitution, which is actually the period of constitutional authoritarianism during the Marcos regime. Presently, with the changing political landscape in our country, there are calls for constitutional convention that aims to change the form of government from unitary to federal, and other proposals espouse for a change from presidential to parliamentary form. But the 1987 Constitution provided three methods by which the Constitution can be amended. Number one, through Constituent Assembly. Number two, through Constitutional Convention. And number three, through People's Initiative. And using these methods, there were exertions to amend or change the 1987 Constitution during the time of the presidency of President Ramos, who succeeded Corazon Aquino. The first attempt was in 1995 when the Secretary of National Security Council, Jose Almonte, drafted a constitution, but it was uncovered to the media and it never thrived. The second effort occurred in 1997 when a group called PIRMA hoped to gather signature from voters to change the constitution through a people's initiative. That many were in contradiction of this, including Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago, who brought the issue to court. and won, with the Supreme Court judging that the People's Initiative cannot push through without an enabling law. Also, the past administration, after President Aquino attempted to change the form of government, although these attempts were not actualized, but presently, the administration of President Duterte is leading the campaign for constitutional change as one of his core government policies, but obviously it never came into fruition because we only have 6 months after before his term would end. And true enough, the 1987 Constitution during Corazon Aquino's term, which is the President Constitution of the Philippines, is still regarded as the most polished and most responsive to the needs of the Filipino people.